The Chernobyl Dilemma, a decade of uncertainty. The Chernobyl disaster, which occurred on April 26, 1986, was the worst nuclear accident in history. The explosion at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukraine SSR released a massive amount of radioactive material into the atmosphere, contaminating vast areas of Europe. A decade after the disaster, the Chernobyl dilemma became a focal point of international discourse, encapsulating the ongoing uncertainties surrounding the health consequences, environmental contaminations, political fallout, and technological challenges linked to the event. Although extensive emergency responses were undertaken into immediate aftermath, the long-term impact remained unclear even 10 years later, leaving scientists, governments, and affected communities grappling with difficult questions and incomplete data. The study of the Chernobyl dilemma a decade after the disaster is critical in understanding how society confronts large-scale technological accidents and their long-term consequences. The uncertainties associated with Chernobyl highlighted gaps in nuclear safety, emergency preparedness, and disaster management, sparking widespread re-evaluation of nuclear policies worldwide. Moreover, it underscored the challenges of managing of a disaster where the consequences unfold over decades, making it a unique case study in both nuclear energy policy and post-disaster recovery.
Findings of the study. The cause of the Chernobyl disaster. The Chernobyl disaster was caused by a combination of design flaws in the RBMK nuclear reactor and operator errors during a safety test conducted on April 26, 1986. Design flaws. The RBMK reactor design had inherent safety weakness, particularly a positive void coefficient, which meant that the reactor power output could increase uncontrollably under certain conditions. The reactor lacked a fully effective containment structures, which could have minimized radioactive release in the event of an accident. Operator error. The operators on duty at the time of the accident disabled several critical safety systems to conduct a routine safety test. This test, which was meant to simulate a out- outage, resulted in unstable conditions that caused a sudden power surge. In a matter of seconds, the reactor's core overheated and exploded. Lack of safety culture. Soviet-era secrecy, bureaucratic efficiencies, and a lack of transparency further contributed to the disaster. Early warning signs and previous incidents at nuclear plant had been overlooked or hidden, preventing proper risk management. Impact of the Chernobyl disaster. Health impacts. Acute radiation sickness, ARS. In the immediate aftermath, approximately 134 workers and emergency responders suffered from IRS, of whom 28 died due to radiation exposure. Environmental impacts. Radioactive contamination. Large swaths of land in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were contaminated by radioactive isotopes, including cesium 137, strontium 90, and plutonium 239. Those isotopes remains in the soil, water, and ecosystems for decades, making the affected regions uninhabitable. Biodiversity. The exclusion zone through off limits to human habitation saw some unexpected ecological impacts. While radiation caused harm to many species, some wildlife populations, such as wolves and wild horses, began to flourish in the absence of human activity. However, mutations and genetic damage were also observed in some aspects. Long-term health effect. The significant long-term health effect observed a decade after the disaster was a sharp rise in hydro cancer, particularly among children exposed to radioactive iodine 131 by the mid 1990s. Thousands of cases had been reported, with projection of more cases emerging over time. Psychological impact. The disaster caused widespread trauma, anxiety, and depression among survivors and displaced populations. Fear of radiation and concerns about health led to long lasting psychological consequences, including a sense of stigma for those living near the disaster zones.
Consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. Political consequences. Soviet Union's response and global criticism. The Soviet Union's initial response was marked by secrecy and a lack of communication with the international community. This slow and opaque response exacerbated global concerns about nuclear safety and led to a widespread criticism of the Soviet government's handling of the crisis. Collapse of the Soviet Union. Chernobyl exposed system failures in Soviet governance, and some scholars argue that it accelerated the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The economic cost and political strain from the disaster contributed to the weakening of the regime. Economic consequences. Massive financial costs. The cost of dealing with the disaster was astronomical, particularly for Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. A decade later, billions of dollars has already been spent on evacuation, compensation for affected populations, and the construction of the sarcophagus around Reactor 4. Economic displacement. The disaster severely disrupted the agricultural and industrial economies of the affected regions. Contaminated land could no longer be used for farming, and the displaced populations face long-term unemployment and poverty. Sociocultural consequences, displacement and trauma. Over 350,000 people were displaced, many of whom were unable to return to their homes. Entire communities were lost, and the trauma of displacement had lasting social and psychological effects on the population. The uncertainty about whether they could ever return home exacerbated feelings of loss and identity crisis. Chernobyl as a symbol. The disaster became a potent symbol of the dangers of nuclear energy, influencing global public opinion and shaping cultural narratives about the risks of technological progress. Resolution efforts, containment and cleanup. Sarcophagus construction. Immediately after the disaster, a massive concrete structure or the sarcophagus was hastily built to contain the radioactive materials within Reactor 4. By the mid 1990s, this structure had begun to deteriorate, raising concerns about its long-term stability. Plans were underway to build a more durable containment structure. New Safety Confinement or NSC in discussions began during the 1990s about constructing the new safe confinement, a more advanced containment system designed to encapsulate Reactor 4 and prevent further radioactive leaks. This massive structure, completed years later, became one of the largest engineering projects in the world. The next is international aid and cooperation. International support, recognizing the global nature of the Chernobyl disaster. International organizations and countries provided financial and technical assistance to aid in containment, cleanup, and research on radiation's effects. This global cooperation was crucial in addressing the long-term challenges posed by the disaster. Health monitoring and research. Medical research programs were initiated to monitor the health effects of radiation exposure on population in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. International agencies such as the World Health Organization, WHO, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, worked with local government to track cancer rates and other health issues. Next is nuclear safety reforms, revelation of nuclear energy. Globally, Chernobyl led to a re-evaluation of nuclear energy policies. Several countries implemented stricter safety regulations, while others phased out their nuclear programs altogether. The disaster raised fundamental questions about the safety of nuclear reactors and the human capacity to manage such technology. Improvements in reactor design. In the wake of Chernobyl, nuclear energies to improve reactor designs and safety protocols to prevent similar accidents. Many older reactors were either decommissioned or retrofitted with new safety features. Is the last conclusion. The study shows that even 10 years after the Chernobyl nuclear accident, there are still unanswered questions in the areas of politics, technology, the environment, and health. The long-term effects of radiation exposure, environmental degradation, and societal relocation persist despite major efforts at containment and cleanup, including the building of the sarcophagus and international cooperation. A decade later, the Chernobyl tragedy remained a hug burden with unanswered questions and uncertainties influencing regional and international views of nuclear energy. The lesson learned from Chernobyl disaster and underscore the necessity of open communication, strict safety procedures, and long-term planning for handling the fallout from significant technological mishaps.